Coming to you live via recording from Appleton, Wisconsin, it's time for your conservative smackdown. In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Right Makes Might. I'm Dr. Duke, your host, and today I'd like to talk to you about silly costumes, safe spaces, and impotent universities. Yes, alas, we return to the dysfunctional place of the American university campus in the news again because college professors, administrators, faculty, PhD-holding adults have ceded their responsibility to lead, to model responsible citizenship, to protect America's rights and freedoms in the face of criticism and even hostile debate by turning over all that power to a group of entitled, whiny, juvenile young college kids who've been made to believe that their solipsistic worlds dictate and authorize them to completely transform the way America does business, from the First Amendment to what does and doesn't get said on college campuses. Well, I'm sure you know it all began this week at the University of Missouri, where all hell broke loose as college kids across the campus are protesting horrible racial incidents on campus, none of which can be verified ultimately, all of which have the whiff of hearsay to them, many of which were just flat out manufactured, no evidence whatsoever to support them. Nonetheless, like any good university college, reality must give way to a sense of entitlement, manufactured grievance, and my feelings, whether they have any basis in reality, must trump everybody else's working knowledge of how things actually work. In September of last year, purportedly, University of Missouri student government president, who happens to be an African-American kid, claimed that a passing pickup truck shouted the N-word at him. We don't even necessarily know that these were if this happened, that it was a university student in the truck who made the comment at him. And in any event, in October, 1 month later, members of an African-American student organization claimed that a drunk student used racial slurs at them. Now that's a revelation. College kids getting drunk and doing stupid things. Maybe, given that a drunk kid perhaps said a racial slur, maybe we should completely crack down on alcohol on college campuses. But that would that not infringe on the little darling's little rights? Can you imagine how these same cultural warriors would react if, in the name of alcoholism, promoting racial slurs, we ban alcohol, right? I mean, that's exactly what we did with the Confederate flag. I mean, or any other aspect of culture that we think may be responsible for inherent latent trigger warnings. We ban it, so let's ban it. And I'd be all for that. Watching how college students behave on college campuses, I would be all for the banning of alcohol whatsoever on university premises. Somehow I don't think that's going to fly with these culture warriors. I wonder about that. And then the event that sparked all of this efflorescence of social grievance, it started when there were claims that a swastika smeared in poop was placed on a dorm room bathroom wall. Now, what's interesting about this? This is a dorm room, right, with people of all different races in it. It's a bathroom wall, right? The allegedly smeared poop swastika had no writing on it, so we don't necessarily know who it was directed at. And the kick in the pants, that nobody took a picture of the swastika when the police were called. They didn't get to see it. There is no evidence that a swastika ever was put there, and so here we are. And moving forward then, we have another situation on the same campus, University of Missouri, and keep in mind that this campus is 90 miles from Ferguson, roughly 90 miles from Ferguson, Missouri. And so what you have descending upon this wonderful campus with these claims, some real, some imagined, you have Black Lives Matter activists. You have all sorts of outside agitators and activists descending on campus to prey upon the scattered carcasses of what would soon be administrative heads. A group of 150 students protesting claims of 2 trucks having ridden by with Confederate flags in the back. Some claim it was to intimidate them. So the pushback begins, predictably, and that's what happens when you get outside agitators, professional agitators coming to campus to link up with mush-brain, entitled little campus advocates who've spent their life in the petri dish that is American university identity politics. Starts with the football team. More than 24 football players announced that they would not participate in team activities until University President Tim Wolfe was removed. As far as we know, Mr. Wolfe was not responsible for smearing anything on anybody's bathroom wall. We also know that he did not have a Confederate flag in his office, but what we do know is that he did not take these incidents, many of which have a tenuous grasp on credibility, and certainly most of them lack any kind of concrete evidence to go after anyone at all. He didn't take those events seriously, meaning he didn't immediately lock down the campus and have mandatory diversity training for everybody. That was followed up by the Concerned Student 1950 group on campus, who draws its name from the year the university accepted its first African-American student. They demanded that the university president, quote, acknowledge his white male privilege, unquote. All right, so let me see if I got this right. The president of the college, a progressive himself, who presides over your typical big state system progressive university, he now has to apologize for his male privilege, his white male privilege. Right? So in other words, he's guilty of all those racial incidents, even though he wasn't named any of them, and it's his white privilege that makes him exactly identical to the person, whoever it was, who may have smeared poop on a wall, or who may have driven by in a car that had the Confederate flag on it, his male privilege, and then once he acknowledges it, that alone is enough to have him removed from his position. And the protesters demanded that the school adopt a mandatory racial awareness program and hire black faculty and staff. Now, the thing that gets me about this is if you've been on any college, any public university college, big, small, in between, there are all sorts of these equality, diversity, tolerance initiatives. In fact, we have a whole bureaucracy of administrators who are making more money than faculty, who are becoming more numerous in many regards than faculty, whose whole job on campus is, from running the dorms to running the classrooms to running the Office of Student Diversity, is to make sure that these initiatives exist. General education programs across the country are being rewritten to conform to models that deal with issues of social justice. The idea that this whole business isn't covered time and time again on American universities, including the University of Missouri, it's just absolutely absurd. But nevertheless, acknowledging his white privilege, looking in the mirror and seeing Casper the Ghost looking back, our university president decided, in the name of social justice and harmony, and I guess as a way of combating his own privilege, he stepped down. Did this make people happy? No. Well, let's just stop and slow down for a moment and talk about that Mizzou football team. What's interesting is, according to ESPN's Outside the Lines, Missouri athletics had over 63 criminal cases involving 46 student athletes between 2009 and 2014. 12 of those athletes were involved in more than one incident, and Missouri had the second highest number of allegations of sexual assault, violence against women, and harassment from the sports teams, particularly the football team. Now, it's interesting that the university is standing by while the Missouri football players protest that what is needed is a safe space on campus. I respectfully suggest that those football players who want a safe space might want to start with their own programs, making the athletic department and the football team in particular conducive to everybody else's safety on campus. Those are pretty shockingly high numbers. And then we have Mr. Jonathan Butler. Jonathan Butler is the flashpoint in many regards for this movement. He found himself at the center of controversy after an 8-day hunger strike in protest of President Wolfe's failure to deal with the alleged injustices on campus. And interesting about Mr. Butler, he spent the last 7 years as a college student, as an oppressed undergraduate and graduate student. One wonders why it took so long to speak out, because the kinds of things that are here considered racist offenses, they surely have been going on all across the country. There's no doubt that people in the last 7 years at Mizzou have been saying things that make some people uncomfortable. There's no doubt that there's been a joke here or a comment here, and this transcends individual races. People are doing it all the time. It's an interesting fun fact about Mr. Butler. He may be crash dieting for racial injustice, but he does come from an extremely rich family of one percenters. His father is an executive vice president for Union Pacific Railroad, making about $8.4 million a year. So in other words, children of privilege, like converts to other religions, they do seem to be the most zealous, don't they, in trying to prove their street cred, trying to prove how much they are men and women of the people. It's an interesting phenomenon. Of course, when religious people do it, they're considered zealots, fundamentalists, whack jobs. Can we say that about Mr. Butler? Probably not, because I suspect that would be some kind of a trigger warning too. Stepping back even further, it's important to remind everybody that the gasoline, again, that ignited this firestorm, or maybe it was just gas, is the infamous poop sticker that apparently appeared on a bathroom wall. And despite living in the age of cell phone cameras, flash media mobs, 24/7 media exposure, everybody being online and cameraed up. No one managed to capture a single image of the fecal faux pas. We have no evidence that it was there, as I said many times. The police who showed up didn't get to see it. And all those students claiming to have seen it, if not smelled it, are backtracking on their stories. Well, I mentioned that I had seen it, but in reality, it was only somebody who told me about it. Hearsay is a wonderful thing. In fact, nobody at the university can be found who actually encountered this piece of potty performance art. Spalding snails could not be reached for comment.
Spalding, no!
Yes, Spalding, you'll get nothing and like it. Unlike our protesters on campus who are getting all their demands met, even though there's no real evidence that the crisis exists. And so that brings us to hateful speech on campus in general. The University of Missouri Police Department is now, in the wake of this horrible crisis, is now asking anybody on campuses who witnesses incidents of hateful speech to report it to the police. So that's wonderful. How do we react to all of this? The president of the university acknowledges white guilt, even though he had nothing to do with the incidents, and he's gone. And now you've got university authorities actually urging kids to narc each other out for saying things that somebody might be offended by. Here is the official statement the department tweeted. To continue to ensure that the University of Missouri campus remains safe, the MU Police Department is asking individuals who witness incidents of hateful speech to, 1, call the police immediately. This is amazing, right? As if campus police have nothing better to do. If somebody says something that offends you, you immediately call the police, get the police to come. So if somebody's watching TV in a dorm, and you happen to walk by, and somebody on the TV makes an insensitive comment, is that not also shattering your safe space? Is this the kind of thing that we have to drag the cops to our dorm rooms for immediately? If you are in an emergency situation, dial 911. So if the unsafe speech really gets you upset, maybe makes you a little nervous, tinkle a little in your pants, then call the actual police at 911. Give the communications operator a summary of the incident, including the location. Provide a detailed description of the individuals involved, and provide a license plate and vehicle description if appropriate, or, if it can be done safely, take a photo of the individual. Now, you couldn't take a photo of the offending poop. Nobody could manage that. But if somebody offends you, if somebody says something that makes you a little bit uncomfortable in your complex way, that sensitive trigger warning way, ask them to stop for a selfie with you. Isn't that wonderful, right? Hey, Mr. Offender, come stand next to me. Let me take your picture so I can call 911 and report you. Hateful speech on campus, right? Fun fact, legally, the University of Missouri's Office of Student Conduct can't take any disciplinary action at all against First Amendment protected free speech, even if a student or faculty member gets their feelings hurt. I know that's unusual, and this is why, we have to get rid of the Constitution. The idea that the Constitution, our founding fathers, did not envision a world where hurt sensitivities would so violate the ethos of the nation. If only we could go back 240 years and enshrine in that document the idea that nobody should ever be offended by anything. I think if we were to do that, maybe the progressive left might have a little more respect for the document. Speaking of First Amendment issues, let's take a look at this short clip of a University of Missouri protester interviewing with an MSNBC host.
I personally am tired of hearing that First Amendment rights protect students when they're creating a hostile and unsafe learning environment for myself and for other students here. I think that it's important for us to create that distinction and create a space where we can all learn from one another and start to create a place of healing rather than a place where we're experiencing a lot of hate like we have in the past. So,
let me get this straight. That the purpose of university education is to create healing places, safe spaces. It's not about education, because real, genuine education means putting you lockstep with ideas you may not agree with. Real education is putting little orchids like this in the line of ideas that are going to challenge and push, and yes, I'll say it, threaten her. If we're not being threatened in our education, if our complacency, our generalizations, our stereotypes aren't being challenged, And that includes the stereotypes. In fact, that especially includes the stereotypes of the left, because on college campuses, those stereotypes become generalizations that form policy, that become the bedrock of all progressive education. And I love the way she started this. I think, in my opinion, I'm sick and tired of people using the First Amendment to justify people saying what they want who I disagree with. So she basically invokes the First Amendment. She takes advantage of it. She gets to say why she thinks the First Amendment shouldn't apply to some people on campus, but it must apply to me. And this is the kind of thing we get, then, with people like this. This is their idea of healing, by the way. Soon after the resignation of President Wolfe, student protesters held a black healing gathering on campus and asked white supporters to leave in order to create, quote, a black-only hearing space. And there you have it. Even when white kids stand in solidarity with black kids, they must be removed from the room. They must be, so get this, the African-American kids stay where they're at. The white supporters, the white kids who support them, are sent out of the room by the black kids to a room upstairs. Holy cow, it gives all new meaning to the moving on up, moving on up. Well, there's your idea of healing and unity right there. Segregation, all right? All you needed was, instead of sending those white kids upstairs, was to bus them to another building. And then you'd have the perfect example of liberal hypocrisy. And we've got Black Lives Matter activists who led this meeting and who counseled these white kids to move. Black Lives Matter activist Jonetta Elzie tweeted, quote, black-only healing space for the students to share, decompress, be vulnerable, and to be real. Black-only healing space. All right. And round two, where we return to the calamity on campus at the University of Missouri. We recognize how University President Tim Wolfe of the University of Missouri system stepped down, forced to admit his shameful white guilt and pay penance for the fact that he didn't immediately lock the university down over some potentially explosive racial incidents. Well, now we know, as the world turns, the soap opera progresses, that the interim president of the university is Mike Middleton, who retired from the university in August after teaching there for 17 years in the law school. Interestingly, he recently worked with the African-American protesters on campus who created the very racial tensions, or at least inflamed them, by staging a series of direct actions designed to antagonize other students. That's what this law professor was involved with. He was also featured in a recent video alongside fellow activist Jonathan Butler, entitled, quote, Response to Skeptics, unquote. Here is Mr. Butler and your new interim president of the University of Missouri.
For people who don't think this is an issue, a very short answer is that you're part of the problem.
What an interesting formulation of healing that Mr. Butler has. Right? You either agree with me, or by denying what I say, you are part of the problem. Those are your only two options. There is no debate, there is no interaction, there is no possibility of legitimate other ways of seeing this. You either agree with what I say, or you're part of the problem. We might expect that from a 7-year college student who comes from a family of tremendous wealth and privilege. We might expect that. After all, 7 years on a university campus is bound to addle anybody's mental capacity. But it's even more alarming when you hear what the new interim president had to say.
How can anyone deny that there's a race relations issue on this campus? Are they not listening to the people who are saying there is?
I mean, if I've ever heard a tautology in my life, I think that's it. There has to be one, because people say they are. Now, if you're a person who says there's not, you're a racist, and you're part of the problem, according to Jonathan Butler. But how could people not believe it? A bunch of college kids said it's true. Kind of reminds me, back in the day, of how Al Sharpton raised all that racial animus about a bunch of white cops who allegedly raped a young African-American girl, Tawana Brawley. Turned out none of it was true. It was completely fabricated. The cops were exonerated only after a tremendous amount of racial animosity, riots, protests. In other words, it's the Rahm Emanuel mantra. It doesn't matter if it's true. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Exploit, exploit, exploit. We're getting this at the top levels now of the university, and we're getting it from the students as well. And then we move forward, right? This isn't just, obviously, the University of Missouri. We have that famous incident right before Halloween a few weeks ago, where Yale administrators sent out a blanket email to all the students on campus. Here's what it says, quote, "Halloween is also, unfortunately, a time when the normal thoughtfulness and sensitivity of most Yale students can sometimes be forgotten, and some poor decisions can be made, including wearing feathered headdresses, turbans, wearing war paint or modifying skin tone, wearing blackface or red face. Yale values free expression as well as inclusivity, and that's where we have to pause. No, Yale, you don't. In fact, most universities don't. Obviously, the University of Missouri doesn't, because we have created a situation on campus when those two things, shockingly and sadly, are mutually exclusive: free expression and inclusivity. We have decided on college campuses, or better yet, we're letting our students decide that we'll take inclusivity as we define it. And that includes sending white people upstairs if they get in the way of our healing sessions. We'll take inclusivity over the right of people to speak freely. And while students, the email continues, definitely have a right to express themselves, isn't it fantastic of Yale to reiterate the fact that students have the right to express themselves, but of course it comes with a codicil. In spite of that, we wish people would actively avoid those circumstances that threaten our sense of community, or disrespects, alienates, or ridicules segments of our population based on race, nationality, religious belief, or gender expression. So again, as always, right, you have the right to speak, you have the right to dress, you have the right to express yourselves. We wish you wouldn't. And if you do dress, speak, or think in a way we don't like, we're not going to defend you, we're not going to support you, we're going to allow mob rule to begin to take over our campuses. And then we get, interestingly, we have a professor on campus who, a very progressive person, Professor Erica Christakis, a professor of young adult education, I believe, who responded with a general email back to the campus. Here's what Professor Christakis wrote, quote, "Even if we could agree on how to avoid offense, and I'll note that no one around campus seems overly concerned about the offenses taken by religiously conservative folks to skin-revealing costumes, I wonder, and I am not trying to be provocative, is there no room anymore for a child or young person to be a little bit obnoxious, a little bit inappropriate or provocative, or yes, maybe even offensive? American universities were once a safe space not only for maturation, but also for a certain regressive, even transgressive experience. But increasingly, it seems, they have become places of censure and prohibition. And the censure and prohibition come from above, not from you. Are we all okay with this transfer of power?" And so what came of all this? Well, Professor Christakis did not turn out into the Yale Quad to meet with angry students, many of whom were calling for the immediate dismissal, the firing of her from her position, simply for that email that you read. In other words, what happened was her husband, Nicholas Christakis, also a professor, he showed up to take the flak. Now that strikes me as remarkably chivalrous.
But sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
no, I don't agree with that.
Then why the did you accept the position?
Because
Who
I have
hired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You are not doing that.
You're supposed to be our advocate.
You should be at the event last night when you hear Franco say that she doesn't know how to create a safe space for her freshmen in Stillman. How do you explain that? These freshmen come here, they think this is what Yale is? Do you hear that? They're gonna leave, they're gonna transfer because you are a poor steward of this community. You should not sleep at night. We're out, we out. You're disgusting.
All the bleeped out F-bombs aside, the dynamic here is unbelievable. "You are disgusting," she says to him. "You should not sleep at night. You should resign your position immediately." Why? Because I disagree with you. That's it. The idea that there can be no debate about this. The idea that you must be our advocate. Your job here as a functioning professor, as the master of a dorm, ultimately, that's the word Yale uses, not my word. Your role here is simply to be our advocate. Whatever we want, you initiate. Whatever we say, you defend. Whoever we dislike, you dislike. Whoever we censure, you censure. Whoever we banish, you banish. And if you can't do that, you step down. Man, this is where it's come to now. And all of this is way beyond Yale, and it's way beyond Missouri. Take what happened recently at the University of Minnesota, when student Theo Menon petitioned the university to observe the anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Menon said, quote, "I wrote this resolution because I think we need to recognize the victims of this world-changing event." Victims, by the way, who were black, Hispanic, Muslim. They weren't just white men. "I wrote this resolution," he wrote, "because I think we need to recognize the victims of this world-changing event, the innocent men, women, and servicemen who died that day and deserve to be honored on this anniversary at the University of Minnesota." In response, the director of diversity and inclusion, David Algadi, said, quote, "The passing of this resolution might make a space that is unsafe for students on campus even more unsafe. Islamophobia and racism, fueled through that, are alive and well." This is unbelievable. You get a kid who tries to get the university, petition the university to remember one more shattering event in American history. Honor those multiracial people, multi-ethnic people, multi-gender people, multi-sexuality people who went down in those buildings. And the director of diversity, I guess what I want to ask too, why in the world is the director of diversity weighing in, shaping opinion on this? In response, this director of diversity said, right, "This resolution is going to make an unsafe space more unsafe." Well, what does that say about you, director of diversity, that you acknowledge that you have an unsafe space? How come you haven't eradicated it? Or the real question, maybe you don't have an unsafe space for Muslim kids. Maybe that's not what's happening here. Maybe your job, sir, depends on the idea that you have to promote the idea that everything is unsafe. Because after all, we need more directors of diversity like you, don't we? If something as simple as a resolution to honor the victims of 9/11 becomes a potential hate crime, a worsening of an already horrific situation on our college campuses, then we need more people like you, don't we? We have to give big fat raises to directors of diversity, all right? We're not giving faculty raises. We're expanding our administrative base over and over again. We're paying you wonder why the cost of tuition is so high. We're paying all sorts of money to academic non-entities whose job it is to stir up trouble, not stir up trouble, to keep trouble brewing, to preserve it, to make up trouble where there really is none, to justify their own positions. Not surprisingly, the Student Government Association decided not to pass the resolution. And it's not just sending white kids out of the room so black kids can heal. It's not just shutting up people you disagree with. It's not forcing white professors to acknowledge their white guilt before you fire them. It's more than that. It's situations like this from Claremont McKenna College in California, where in a big circle dedicated to using a megaphone to promote all of the institutional racism and the unsafe nature of campus, we have the following video.
We should not distinguish people by their race or gender or anything. Black people can be racist. White people, sorry. Oh no.
No, we're getting derailed. All right, you're losing sight of the movement. All right, I understand your sentiments. We all have our journeys and we can all hurt people. We get it.
So, in this circle of inclusivity where everybody gets to step forward and demonstrate their perfect, unique snowflakeness, an Asian American woman steps up and makes the argument that we shouldn't, what used to be, by the way, a traditionally liberal argument, we're all the same under the color of our skin. We should not judge people on their appearances. Black people, too, can be racist. You notice how quickly the tolerant members of our little Barney circle close her down. Right? She's shuffled off the stage, the megaphone's taken from her little hand, right? We can't have that. And then our activist steps forward and says, we're losing a sense of the movement here, people. This is not about tolerance. This is not about the idea that we're all the same under the skin. This is about promoting one very, very racialized view of what a grievance is. When an Asian, a minority, a female student, right, who obviously doesn't speak very good English, who's not been in this country very long, gets up and expresses from a communist country of all places like China, gets up and makes more common sense than a bunch of completely Americanized protesters, you know the country's in trouble. Well, it was inevitable, wasn't it? Given how utterly progressive universities are, given the absolutely uniform progressive views of the faculty and the administration and the presidents, given all of that, it just stands to reason. If you stir up a cauldron of intolerance on campus, you motivate kids to see everything in terms of race. You prepare kids to be absolutely oriented to be offended. then inevitably what was going to happen was it was going to be liberal professors. It was going to be minority professors, liberal minority professors who are paying the price as well. If your whole student body and faculty is primarily progressive, then who's getting caught in college campuses? We saw the president of University of Missouri, Tim Wolfe. He's a doctrinaire liberal. He couldn't stay. And now we have from Vanderbilt University. Well, Vanderbilt University professor dubbed hateful. They want to put her on, they want to suspend her. They want to send an African-American female to diversity training. At Vanderbilt University, an online student petition demanding the suspension of professor of law and political science Carol Swain for being, quote, hateful, unquote, towards minorities has received more than 1,000 signatures. Her credentials: Carol Swain is an American political scientist, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. She's also a television host. She is the author and editor of 6 books. Her scholarly work has been cited by 2 associate justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. And she has to be sent for racial retraining. Why? Professor Swain is accused of making politically incorrect statements about Islam in one of her Christian culture courses. The petitioners are demanding she be sent to a diversity training camp so her lectures will be more accepting of radical Islam. So, in a course devoted to teaching Christian culture, right, any effort whatsoever to historically link up the battles between Islam and Christianity through history, any suggestion that Islam is, among other things, a bit of a Jewish Christian heresy. Many have made that argument. Any idea to set Islam, the basic tenets of Islam's or the behavior of Islamic countries alongside Christian countries, that's now hateful. This woman is an African American, she's a female, she's a minority, she's a respected scholar, and she too has fallen into the trap here. The day when 20-something college kids know more than accomplished professors like that of any race or gender, we got problems. But that's not all. You've got here California State University Northridge, Professor Robert Oscar Lopez. All right? He's accused of a Title IX violation for exposing students to social conservative thought during an optional assignment at an event he hosted at the Reagan Library. So he gave this fairly progressive individual, he gave a talk at the Reagan Library. He made it an optional opportunity for kids to attend. So that becomes a Title IX violation. What was the topic on? It was focused on family relationships and the rights of children. Students waited months after the university deadlines to file this complaint of discriminatory misconduct and retaliation against Professor Lopez. Ultimately, Professor Lopez was eventually exonerated of discrimination charges, but found guilty of retaliating against students for simply asking the angry students if they're going to file charges against him. And Lopez himself denies making any such threats, although I don't see the threat in asking students such a thing. Nevertheless, fun fact, according to the Daily Caller, Lopez was raised by a lesbian couple. He is himself Hispanic. He is or was bisexual. He is now married to a woman. He has also spoken publicly about growing up, how he desperately wanted a father. And he preaches the importance for children to have both a mother and a father. You could see how that would run afoul of the gender warriors who want to insist that manhood in particular, fathers in particular, are utterly necessary in a home. Now, this is a young, progressive man, bisexual, Hispanic, who lamented the lost father in his own life. And for that, well after the due date, he was persecuted by his students. This was a Title IX violation. Whole bells and whistles later, he was exonerated, but at what cost?
Do you have a question or comment you'd like Dr. Duke to respond to? Email the show at media@fpeusa.org.
And now it's time for the knockout round. Well, as we've seen from university campus all across the country, from Claremont McKenna on the West Coast to Yale University on the East Coast and to the University of Missouri right smack dab in the middle of the country, we have created a horrifying situation where young kids, generations of college kids, have been nurtured in a kind of a liberal embryonic womb where they are completely shielded from any idea that bothers them, that upsets them, that runs counter to simple-minded liberal progressive thought. And the university professors that have done this have basically created a monster, a Frankenstein's monster, of kids who now, anything they hear, anything that's said, any book that is put in front of them, any great classic that they have to encounter that doesn't completely replicate their worldview and nurture in them a sense of special entitlement, those books, those teachers, those classes have to be removed. To take another classic example of this from Professor Allie Michael of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Professor Michael recently wrote at the Huffington Post, quote, "There was a time in my 20s when everything I learned about the history of racism made me hate myself. my whiteness, my ancestors and my descendants, I remember deciding that I couldn't have biological children because I didn't want to propagate my privilege biologically. Whatever good news that is for the gene pool of America, the fact remains is that it's a startling statement. Note, she hates her ancestors, she hates herself, she hates her descendants. She hates those who came before her because of a sense of racism that was constructed by professors like Mrs. Michaels. She hates herself, she hates her descendants, even those unborn she hates because of their whiteness. You think about what's happening here. If you had just simply replaced the word white with any other race or gender or even class in that sentence, this would be seen as a kind of reverse Stockholm system. In Stockholm system, captives come to identify with their terrorists, right? This is a reverse, right? The very white professors who taught Professor Michaels to hate herself, to hate her descendants, to hate her ancestors, to hate so much being white that she will not have children, those very professors now have turned her into a racist, using every single trick of racial profiling, of one-dimensional racial propaganda, of bigotry, of generalization. She went on to write, quote, "I disliked my whiteness, but I disliked the whiteness of other white people more." That's the reverse Stockholm syndrome. As much as I hated myself for being white, I hated every other white person more for their whiteness. And that includes irreparably, you can't get around it, that includes her students. She hates her white students. Why would we allow a self-confessed hater, a self-confessed bigot, a racial profiler, a dabbler in racial stereotypes, projected down from biblically, from generation to generation? Why we let a woman like this teach college? Well, that's because of the progressive mindset. And I'd like to stipulate moving forward that there is a shocking, disturbing, and altogether sinister link between what's going on in our university campuses and what just happened in France, the horrific terrorist shootings. One of the most vehement responses to what happened in France was from the Missouri protesters, many of whom took to Twitter to condemn the fact that the slaughter taking place in France was cutting into their media time. Remember what happened at the University of Missouri. We had a make-believe poop swastika that nobody ever really saw. We had some odd potential racial incidents on campus, although none of them were documented, no evidence that any of them ever occurred. A lot of make-believe outrage, a lot of activists from the Ferguson protests who made the 90-mile trip to hop on the Mizzou campus to help agitate. A lot of these people, a lot of these students, professors, a lot of these protesters, absolutely stunned and mortified that real slaughter in a place like Paris would get in the way of their make-believe outrage on campus. Some of the interesting tweets, quote, "Interesting how the news reports are covering the Paris terrorist attacks, but said nothing about the terrorist attacks at Mizzou." As if we haven't had a week of wall-to-wall Missouri coverage. Now the slaughter of over 100 people in France bumped them off the news, and that is also a sign of racism. The safe space has been violated. How about this one? Now people are desensitizing Black Lives Matter and Mizzou for what's happening in Paris. Have you no common decency? Another one, don't use the tragedy in Paris to try to undermine the awful things that are happening in Mizzou. In other words, how dare you take some of our genuine compassion and give it away to people whose families have been murdered, when in reality it should all be us because of the infamous poop swastika. Both of these events are terrible. How about this one? We can remember the tragedy in Paris and still remember Mizzou. We are capable of multitasking. Both situations are equally messed up. It took a fellow student to point out that there is no shortage of empathy here, although the empathy is not necessarily morally equal, is it? What the murderous things happening in France versus some manufactured outrage on a college campus, it shows you just so much how we've lost our moral, ethical, even our reasonable compass on campuses.
Don't miss a second of Dr. Duke. Visit FreedomProject.com and sign up for our free newsletter. Like us on Facebook or follow us in the Twitterverse. All the links can be found at FreedomProject.com.